And we begin tonight with less than 3 weeks left on the campaign trail and two campaigns that could not be any more different. We have Vice President Kamala Harris sending a unity message of country before party versus Donald Trump, who puts himself before country. And it is because her opponent is Donald Trump, unfit, unhinged, and anti-democratic, that Kamala Harris is making inroads into a broad coalition that we have not seen really in the 21st century. A coalition of Democrats, independents, and Republicans united for democracy and united against Trump. Moments ago, Harris even ventured into the hostile television territory for the first interview that she's had thus far on Fox. Though the first portion of the interview was entirely about immigration, the vice president managed to wrestle away from migrant crisis fear-mongering to address the stakes of this election.
Are they misguided, the 50%? Are they stupid? What is it?
I would never say that about the American people. And in fact, if you listen to Donald Trump, if you watch any of his rallies, he's the one who tends to demean and belittle and diminish the American people. He's the one who talks about an enemy within, an enemy within, talking about the American people, suggesting he would turn the American military on the American people. You and I both know that he has talked about turning the American military on the American people. He has talked about going after people who are engaged in peaceful protest. He has talked about locking people up because they disagree with him. This is a democracy.
The vice president may not be the first Democratic candidate to appear on Fox, but her message to Republicans is resonating with big names across the aisle. Today, more than 100 Republicans stood alongside her in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia, as she delivered a strong rebuke of her opponent.
Donald Trump is increasingly unstable and unhinged. Anyone who has called for the, quote, termination of the Constitution of the United States, as Donald Trump has, must never again stand behind the seal of the President of the United States.
This type of crossover appeal within our two major political parties is extremely rare. You had the Reagan Democrats, white male Democrats motivated by social conservatism, who defected in the presidential elections of the 1980s to vote for the Republican candidate. Reagan Democrats were such a decisive phenomenon, there's still a mythical quality to them, something to be debated and studied. It's not like you hear the term Bush Democrats or Obama Republicans or Republicans for Clinton. I mean, can you imagine? You know what you do hear, though, these days? Republicans for Kamala. It's a result of her message and commitment to unity, something her opponent has no interest in. In a Fox town hall in battleground Georgia, Trump appeared before an audience of all women because, hosting an adjudicated rapist for an all-woman town hall is exactly what Fox would greenlight. From this town hall, Trump doubled down on his Hitler talking points about the enemy from within.
It is the enemy from within, and they're very dangerous. They're Marxists and communists and fascists, and they're sick. I use a guy like Adam Schiff because they made up the Russia hoax. We have China, we have Russia, we have all these countries. If you have a smart president, they can all be handled. The more difficult are, the Pelosi's, these people, they're so sick and they're so evil.
Turns out Trump's enemies from within aren't undocumented immigrants, as his followers want you to think. I see you, Glenn Youngkin. Those enemies are actually Democrats elected by the people who happen to disagree with him. Dictator much? Joining me now is David Jolly, MSNBC political analyst and former Republican congressman, and Robert P. Jones, president of the Public Religion Research Institute. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I do want to start with you, David, because, I just was making a couple notes as I was listening there. You had in Bucks County, Pennsylvania today, the former lieutenant governor of Georgia. We had our friend Olivia Troy, who worked in the Trump administration. You had Adam Kinzinger, very conservative Republican former congressman. You had Vice President Harris praising Mike Pence and saying, but for him, we might not still have our democracy. And then there was the literal physical embrace of the two people who introduced her. This couple who were longtime, lifelong Republicans. The husband had voted twice for Donald Trump. They were a couple that had a farm, so they're rural folks.
That's right.
And it strikes me that part of what Vice President Harris is doing, including in that Bret Baier interview, is saying that part of the way to bring the country together is a literal physical embrace of people who, for a lot of Democrats, are an anathema, people who voted for Donald Trump. But she's saying, no, you could have worked for him. You could have voted for him. You could have voted for him twice. You're still my people, and I will even go to your favorite network and argue on your behalf.
Joy, I love to see Vice President Harris in this environment because, for one, strategically, there are very few gettable voters left in the next 2 weeks. This is a group of gettable voters. I mean, it's kind of unorthodox for a Democratic candidate to think, I need to spend part of my last 2 weeks going after Republican voters. But they're available because, as you mentioned, you know, kind of the grassroots support from Republicans who can't vote for Trump again. And up there also were about 100 former members of Congress, at least on the email chains that I saw, that could or couldn't make it, that represent districts across the country. I mean, this was not just your Kinzinger-Cheney event, and it shouldn't be. This was your Vice President Harris event, because right now she's the most powerful voice to either never Trump or soft Republicans, pro-democracy Republicans, whatever you want to call them. And in some ways, I think we're beginning to see, again, this sounds unorthodox, the closing message from the two candidates. Because as much as Vice President Harris has talked about policy and wants this race to be about policy, many voters want to vote on reproductive freedom and other issues. This race is really about Donald Trump and whether or not he's a danger to the nation and what happens if he returns. And the Vice President is realizing that as well. And it seems odd to make it simply about the Donald Trump brand and the danger of Donald Trump. But if your most gettable voters are actually Republicans who disagree with you on policy but want to protect the country, Donald Trump's also giving us his closing message, that there are enemies within that he's going to round up with the U.S. military. I feel very good about that contrast if I'm Vice President Harris going into these last 2 weeks.
Because now that he's expanded enemies within, he was talking about immigrants, particularly non-white immigrants who wants to round up in camps. Oh, apparently Adam Kinzinger is on the list, as well as Speaker Pelosi. You and I, Robbie, were together earlier today at Brookings because the question of what is available to Vice President Harris, I think, is relevant and germane, because we live in a country where, just to quote some of the new poll, Public Religion Research Institute, I always say is my favorite polling outfit. You guys are, because you guys do real great numbers, not like the sort of trash polls that we sometimes see dumped into the marketplace. I like to talk about that here. PRRI survey, your New American Values survey. Support for political violence. Let's put it up on the screen. A third of Republicans supporting political violence. Whether or not society has become too soft and feminine. 73%, three-quarters of Republicans saying that, and saying that's a problem in the country. Immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country, something we never thought we'd hear an American president say. Look at the number of Republicans who agree with that statement. And I will even note that some of the people who agree with that statement included almost a quarter of Jewish voters, 19% of Black Protestants, Mormon voters, a third of them. And then, my last one here, whether or not undocumented migrants should be rounded up and put into militarized encampments, 79% of Republicans. What's even available to Vice President Harris outside of core Democrats?
Yeah, well, first let me say, as you know, I've been doing this for nearly 20 years, and there are questions that we have had to write during the Trump era as social scientists that I never thought we would have to write. So to write that question and put it on a public opinion survey and say, we actually need to know what the American people think about this statement, that whether immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country, right? It's just, I think we should just pause for a minute and say how astonishing that is. And so even I look at these numbers all the time, and it is astonishing to me that, we need to know the answer to that question. But that's where we are in the country today. And you said it's 6 in 10 Republicans, one of our two political parties. And this is, as you said, you've already used the word Nazi. And we're all taught to kind of not be knee-jerk and kind of use the Nazi analogy. But
Hitler ad absurdum is the term. If you start using Hitler, you're losing.
Right. But poisoning the blood, Mein Kampf uses the word blood 150 times, right? That's Hitler's word, right? And it's almost always used in this way, this kind of idea of purity and defilement, contamination, and it's a politics of disgust that we're really seeing here. So it's really challenging when you see this argument, and we've got, again, 6 in 10 Republicans, for this, also in violence, right? A third, 1 in 3. Republicans saying we may have to resort to violence to save the country. Like, that's the place that we're in. So, but I do think there's this, that back to your original point, is that I do think that one of the biggest contrasts we're seeing is we never saw Donald Trump saying, I will be a president for all Americans. Right. We never saw that. I think back in 2016, people thought, oh, he'll pivot once he gets elected and we'll hear him. But then we heard that inauguration address, right, when he was first elected. And it was exactly what we're getting now, right? It was apocalypse, and it was, I am the president for the people who elected me, and that's it. And I think one of the things we're seeing for Harris is her saying exactly the opposite. I want to be a president for all Americans.
Well, so here's the question then. I mean, you are the numbers guy, and I want both you guys to answer this question. If we live in a country where 60% of self-identified Republicans essentially believe what Hitler believed, right, in terms of people should be rounded up, they're poisoning our blood, how is this country governable by somebody like Vice President Harris, as much as she is reaching out and saying everyone here? She refused to take the bait from Bret Baier, who wanted to try to get her to insult Trump's supporters. She wouldn't do it. Yeah. But she then would have to, if she wins, govern a country in which percentages of people at that level believe those kinds of things. How does that work?
It wasn't that long ago that we had bipartisan support for immigration reform in this country, right? But Trump has really taken the Republican Party on this journey, and he's pulled people with him. I do think that means, though, that if we get Trump out of the kind of stoking that fire, we may see some of that come back. I mean, even 8 years ago, we had a majority of Republicans supporting a pathway to citizenship in this country.
Quaint times.
Down to 36%.